Welcome to The Imposters.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nana Ama Boa Amponsem. I'm sure you're very surprised to hear a new person giving the intro today, but I'm very happy to be joined by Lila, our regular host for The Imposters. And today, for this episode, we're going to be doing something quite different. All season, Lila's the one who's asking the questions. Today, however, I'm taking her seats and she's going to be the one answering the questions that I bring. So this season took us through a number of different conversations. And what we want to do today is really one, reflect on the different conversations and the different threads across the entire season. And then two, zoom out on what these reflections mean for people doing the work, for policymakers, for the architecture underneath all of this. And then, of course, find out from Lila what this is segueing onto. So Lila, please go ahead to introduce yourself.
My name is Lila Raouf. I'm the creator and founder of The Imposters. I kind of self-identify as a refugee education and emergency specialist. I have over 10 years of experience working across government, nonprofit, NGO, multilateral institutions, mainly focused on humanitarian education and education development. That's a little bit about me, and I'm excited to see what happens when you flip the script and we switch places.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lila, for joining us. And can you take us back to the overall thinking of this project? What sparked the idea for the imposters? I know you've mentioned these in bits across the different episodes, but can we deep dive into what's birthed this whole idea for the imposters podcast?
Sure. Yeah, I refer to it in a couple of different ways, but I don't think I've told really like the full story around this. First of all, this idea is really like a product of my entire lived experience since I was a kid, but I can pinpoint it down to when I entered university. So, for starters, I'm Egyptian American and I grew up in the deep South, Alabama of the United States. And when I entered university, I was really almost desperate to reconnect with parts of my Egyptian identity and heritage that I felt had been lost or even taken from me due to what happens with family migration and then also white supremacy in the United States. So I didn't have Arabic language. I didn't really understand the regional history. So I thought of higher education as an opportunity to learn more and regain those parts of my identity. So when I enrolled and to Middle Eastern courses, I almost immediately noticed that no one else in these courses looked like me. They weren't coming from the same background, identity wise, not really sure what their motivation was, but I tended to be the only Arab, North African descent person in the room studying Middle Eastern culture, politics, language, etc. So I remember in one class, I got introduced to Edward Said's Orientalism. And Edward Said is like a really important thinker, post-colonial thinker in the Middle East. He was Palestinian American and he was a famous professor at Columbia University. And he coined the theory Orientalism, which is basically, in a nutshell, that the West has, through the way we depict Arabs and people from the general East, it's almost either fetishizing or they're all one thing. They're all terrorists. They're all belly dancers. They're all snake charmers. And creating this very homogenous depiction of an entire region was a way for the West to conquer. Um, and it's had a lot of symptoms. So I remember learning this and sitting in my class, and all of my peers and colleagues were like shaking their head, like, yes, Orientalism is bad. And to me, I was just like, irritated and angry because it's like, this is Orientalism. Like, what we're doing right now is
Okay.
Orientalism. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
learning. We're learning about the global South in a Western institution through their perspective at a predominantly white institution at that. But that's not something I shared aloud at the time. I didn't have the theory or the critique to really understand what I was feeling. I just felt kind of like an outsider. And I think I felt a bit like an imposter, like, I'm not good enough to be here. And, my lived reality is not being reflected in this coursework. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't understand my family's background. Maybe all my experience in Egypt was just anecdotal. Maybe that's not the reality. And then I entered development and humanitarian spaces where I was always focused on Middle East, North Africa population and often working for the US government. So you can imagine that I was often in rooms where my context was explained to me and I never was necessarily asked my opinion. Often I felt like people didn't even register, or even know that I had connection, personal
Perfect. Yeah.
connection to that region. Yeah, so, again, I held this really, like, independently, for a long time, and then I would say kind of like the rupture happened maybe when, I was a Fulbright scholar and went to UCL, the Institute of Education, and I just through conversations with a lot of really, like, amazing, like-minded scholars, I realized that it's not just me. This imposter syndrome, whatever we want to call it, and different conversations throughout the podcast, people use different terms to describe this feeling. There is a pattern there, it seems. And so I kind of just hit a point and I referred to it in one of the episodes, one of the fellow imposters, Aya. I had a conversation with her through our master's program at a networking event where I was kind of like, this is the last straw, you know? She's more qualified than anyone to speak on this topic, and she's asking, at least in my interpretation, she's asking for, permission rather than others asking her for her opinion and expertise. So yeah, it's just a long, long time coming, I would say. And I think I found my academic voice through my master's at UCL. And so not only am I interested in this topic, I'm also interested in producing knowledge and research in accessible, interesting formats. And that's where I decided of all the different ways I want to pursue this topic, storytelling and podcasting. Um, is the most interesting format for me.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that story, Lila. And what I hear you say is almost that you felt this way, and the podcast was almost like a test of, is it me? Is it a broader phenomenon that we need to have a conversation on? Which is interesting because while I also listened to all the different episodes, I was a guest, but also there were many other guests. And it's almost interesting that I would listen to an episode and I will feel like whoever was the guest was literally articulating my own feelings. And I found that so interesting because there were no other Ghanaians. I believe I was the only Ghanaian. There were different literally people from different countries, different backgrounds, but we all had this core. And like you said, we articulated it differently, but at the very core, it was really the same underlying experience. Yeah. So as you had these different conversations with different individuals, different practitioners, would you say that your perception was validated across the different conversations? Does this feeling that you expressed and which brought you into the project sit differently for you now? Is there a way that it has changed? Is it even wrong? Right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think the point of the project is whether or not I'm right about, this idea or this theory. I'm just genuinely curious. I like talking to people and I like talking to people about this topic in particular. So it's an opportunity to bring us together and let's talk about it together. I think we've only had 11 conversations at this point, and there are definitely themes emerging that supports at least my initial theory that maybe a unintentional symptom of coloniality is this imposter syndrome, because coloniality has suggested that expertise lives in the global north to be transferred to the global south. And so when you grow up with institutions and education systems telling you that, then, I think it's very plausible to make the connection that you believe that you don't have expertise. So I think we're on to something, but I will say that even though we started with the same foundational question, which was, do you ever feel like an imposter? A very simple way to start each conversation. You'll notice that each conversation kind of goes a different direction. So this isn't a simple topic by all means, and it's very contextualized. And each person, depending on where they come from, what their background is, how much have they interrogated this idea of imposter syndrome, the conversations go a million different directions, which makes it even more exciting. So, like in your conversation, we get into more about talking about localization because that's a topic you and I have in common. We have experience and interest in that. And some of them take a more like psychosocial route about reflecting on, how imposter syndrome has affected us. So, yeah, it's interesting because I'm a pretty impulsive person, so I kind of just had this idea. I was like, "I'm just gonna do it." I had a general framework for what I was going for, but, like, the richness of the conversations is not really something I could have predicted. So I'm really happy with the results, and I think we have enough, evidence, you can say, to at least move on to a second season and keep, exploring this topic.
Wonderful, wonderful. Would you say that there was a particular conversation that struck you differently, almost like a different realization to what you already knew?
Yeah, it's really hard to choose one. I'll say one that still makes me like emotional when I re-listen to it is my conversation with Samia Masari. I was genuinely shocked when we started getting into her professional background, when she started sharing her experience working with international organizations while in Pakistan, also from the United Kingdom. I know Samia. She and Afreen, the first episode, were my first friends in London. I've met her family, I've spent time with them. And you can tell when you listen to it that I was genuinely shocked and a little bit emotional because I was realizing as I was listening to her that I didn't know her expertise. And that's because I didn't ask. And that's like the whole point. I don't want to give the imposters too much credit too early, but I do think it goes to show when you curate a truly safe space for people to share on their terms, like really what richness and results you can see. I studied alongside Samia. We have the same degree. And, I'd love to hear her response, but at least from my viewpoint, she didn't speak as freely in our courses at UCL compared to how freely she spoke her mind in our episode. I think it perfectly demonstrates how valuable lived expertise is and how easily it can be overlooked by how our institutions have been built to recognize knowledge and leadership. So anyway,
Yeah.
great episode. Definitely give it a second listen.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely do agree. And on what you say about not knowing because you didn't ask, I agree. That's literally the entire point, right? Of the conversations. It's almost like unraveling what this means, having a preconceived understanding of an individual, their expertise, and almost projecting what you know on them. So thank you for sharing that. I think Aya's episode, I thought that was very interesting. And in my episode, for instance, I talked about the feeling of being an imposter, not a personal thing. And the first guest who I listened to and who talked about that, of course, it ran across the different conversations as well. But Aya's was when I first realized that, okay, well, this was another conversation. And it
Was
wasn't
spot on.
exactly. And that's exactly how I also felt. Um, I want to first of all let you talk about not just hair episode, but just generally the concept of the imposter syndrome not being an individual feeling or personal feeling, but really what systems produce. So that's one part of my question. And the second part of it is what is the role of local expertise and this local knowledge in moving the needle in global development just generally?
Sure. So I think actually, okay, so if we're interrogating this idea, this theme that's emerging that maybe imposter syndrome is not just personal insecurity. Maybe it's something produced by our systems because of how these systems have historically defined expertise and knowledge. And we're talking about in the humanitarian and development industry in this particular sector that has a very specific history. So if we're talking about that, the episodes definitely provide evidence that maybe it's not just personal insecurity. If you have 11 conversations and they're all kind of referring to the same experience, then it's something worth exploring more. What is surprising, what I loved about this project, I don't know if it's coming through in the final version of the episodes because there's so much conversation that happens in the background that doesn't make it to the final edit. But when you actually have like a real relationship with your participants, which I do, most of the time I've known everyone that I've selected for the first season and we've worked together in some way. So there is some baseline relationship there. People are really honest with me. I would say people are not telling me what I want to hear. And, Afreen is a good example of that. Samia really set me straight in her episode. And Aya actually is a good example too. She's very soft spoken and extremely humble, but she was correcting me if you really listen to it. She complicated it a bit more and she said that it's more of a mix. There are some things that we do need to work on in terms of skills, experience, so when you feel that imposter syndrome, she coined it as like diagnostic tools. So it's pointing at something like, and then you use it and you interrogate that feeling more. Is there something that I need to work on, or are there certain systemic structures at play that we need to be aware of? And she very clearly argued that it's often a mixture of both, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And she very confidently said that she's not afraid of the imposter syndrome and that she uses it to further her own, personal growth and building, and also to acknowledge and recognize the systems that we're working within and work to change them. Yeah. So when it comes to local expertise and moving the needle for global development, I think this topic also very naturally came up because although we're talking about imposter syndrome, I'm mostly interested in elevating lived expertise in global development. So that's also coming up in a lot of our conversations. Aya's episode, she also talks very eloquently about bridging the global and the local because there are some strengths of global infrastructures and the institutions at a global level. There's a perspective there that can be taken advantage of, but also meeting that with the local perspective. And that I think is where we start talking about what true localization looks like. So she's backs up a little bit and talks about the importance of meeting both. And then I think your episode, we kind of get into the weeds a little bit more about what do we mean by localization. And I think you and we are aligned in that localization and local expertise, it comes down to whose voices matter in decision making, not consulted as an afterthought or not consulted as one opinion, but who is setting the agenda? What are the issues at hand? Who's in control? Ultimately, localization is going to come down. If we really, really care about localization, it's going to come down to power, which I know is topic that people feel uncomfortable not only talking about, they also don't know how to action that or operationalize that. But it is going to come down to which voices are leading, which I believe I'm quoting you when you said that. So not only are we noticing through these conversations, imposter syndrome is maybe this pattern that we should interrogate. Another policy point that came out of these conversations is the need to elevate local voices and local expertise in this industry.
I like what you said about the different conversations, almost articulating different things in very interesting ways. And my next question is beyond, existing theories like localization, coloniality, and all of those, were there new concepts? I know that I had noted that Thawat, for instance, talked about accountability having different directions. So upward to donors, governments, sideways to between organizations, and then downwards to the people that organizations continuously engage with. And outside of this, would you say there are key concepts that will be interesting to kind of dive deeper in academia, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Tharwat definitely hit something, and I was reflecting on it because he essentially makes the argument for accountability to affected populations that these organizations already know how to do evidence generation, monitoring, evaluation. in multiple directions. They do it up to donors, they do it sideways, and they do it internally within staff. And so he was making a very nice, easy point that, well, if we can already do it in these different directions, then we can do it towards the affected population as well. It's just a matter of do we want to? So that was excellent. I will say, I think he connected a couple of dots. These conversations are making connections between concepts that are not currently recognized in the humanitarian sector. So I don't know if that means they're new or not. But so, for example, there are very few areas where I'm going to give the United States credit. But I will say a very large portion of the population has undergone a lot of unlearning over the past 15 years. And this is mainly due to the Black Lives Matter movement and then the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And our society, those that are interested, have gone through a lot of unlearning. And there has been this huge surge in social justice vocabulary. And one of the results of that, especially under the Biden administration, is ICDE and I work. So inclusion, diversity, intercultural competence. There's a lot of words for that, but it has been embedded in organizational culture. So often in organizations, you're going to see inclusion officers, diversity officers. This is all organizational development. They analyze from recruitment all the way to senior management. How are we, living these values? And so for a while, we were seeing that change in organizations. I will say, though, I've never seen this change in the international development humanitarian sector. I have some theories about why that is. I mean, obviously, these are changes that came through like the US government electoral system. So there has been a little bit of buy in, but these concepts already exist. And often they're being created by Black Americans, and so they're already there. Why have they not transferred over to the humanitarian sector? So Tharwa is making connections that already exist in other industries. So the evidence is there, the structures are there. There's entire degrees about how you can study and operationalize this. But I, at least in my experience, haven't seen it in the development and humanitarian sector. So his conversation was sparking new connections for me, which was really interesting. I mean, Tharwa also coined the term explaining souls, which I thought was a really lovely way of putting like when two people who are committed to unlearning come together, they can have like an open free conversation, and that's like where real work happens. I also
Yeah.
thought in terms of making connections, Copy, who was episode 4 and 5, whenever we started talking about imposter syndrome, he very naturally referred to his experiences with marginalization and discrimination. And so that got me to thinking that when we're talking about imposter syndrome, maybe we're just talking about marginalization. And that was an interesting take in how he interpreted the feelings of imposter syndrome for this podcast. And again, I think in certain spaces in America, we would call his experiences marginalization and racism and discrimination. We would jump from imposter syndrome going to straight to, yes, this is prejudice. So it makes me think maybe that's a route of terminology we could explore more in connecting to this project. Jill's episode also, she like really eloquently coins contextual intelligence, which is lived experience to a T. And maybe that's a very like technocratic term that we should use more for people to take it more seriously. But
Yeah.
contextual
Yeah.
intelligence, the people who
Yes.
understand the context, and they tend to be the ones who are from there, have worked, studied, lived within that context. Just two more. Gosh, she said so many wonderful things, but shout out to her research on peace education in Sudan universities. She refers to universities as laboratories of hope, which I thought was
I
really beautiful,
absolutely love that one. Yeah. 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 But please
really
go ahead.
sweet. Yeah, and it makes sense because universities are young, energetic people, and we're meant to think and criticize and experiment. That's the whole point. So they are laboratories of hope, which was like so moving. And then last one I can think of is Najla, who provided a lot of expertise on refugee-led organizations. What I love about Najla's episode is that she's not holding back at all. Like, this was her opportunity to like lay it straight for anyone who didn't understand the importance of refugee-led organizations in the system. And she said, the point is we are moving from including RLOs in the system to RLOs are the system. So when we're talking about localization, we're not just adding them and like mixing the pot, you know? They are the system and everybody else needs to get on board. And I thought that was a really powerful take.
There was also, I wouldn't say it's new vocabulary, but I also really liked when Mai talked about pockets of epistemic resistance, right? First of all, do you see the podcast and the projects as one of such, based on how she explained and defined it? These are, and I'm paraphrasing here, spaces where people don't have to fight to be taken seriously, and where people who contribute and people are credited as owners of that knowledge. And so that's kind of paraphrasing what pockets of epistemic resistance is. Can you bring this in the context of the imposters as a project and how you see this in that light?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, May's episode is fabulous. We designed her episode to provide some of the teachings of the theory underpinning this podcast. So this entire concept has multiple post and decolonial theories and thinkers, have already thought of this before. So giving that credit and then also, providing some theoretical grounding before we get deeper into the conversations throughout the season. So her episode is really important, especially if you're new to some of these concepts. It's important to listen to that one to make sure the rest of them make sense. But yeah, pockets of epistemic resistance. So epistemic, if we're talking about knowledge building, and then resistance is how are we basically disrupting the system, quote unquote. So in this context, we're just providing a different perspective and we're critiquing these large historical narratives and having open dialogue and conversation about it. So, yes, absolutely. I think of the imposters as one example of a pocket of epistemic resistance, not only because of the content that we're talking about, which is not mainstream within our sector. Actually, Fidela in the final episode, the finale, as she points out, it's not even on the table in a lot of these organizations. They're not there yet. And then also you can think about the format is epistemic resistance, in my opinion. So May makes a great point, and we talk about this in her episode that um, research and evidence building, it's very rigid. The structures are very rigid, academic language is very formal, and it's very exclusionary. So not many people can access it. Even the fact that many articles are not open access, like, makes that point very clear. So the knowledge is not open, it's not free for everyone, and not everyone can A, access it, and B, contribute to it. So that makes us question who is creating the knowledge that we're consuming. So by taking these conversations and putting them in a different format through storytelling and as a podcast that's, available for everyone, I'm hoping to create a pocket of epistemic resistance where taking these really complicated concepts and through storytelling, making them more accessible and understandable to a wider audience.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I would want you to zoom out into what you think that the role of these different pockets of epistemic resistance mean in the context of the wider sector, both in education and global development. What does this mean for INGOs, for instance, for donor agencies, multilaterals? Can you get into this a bit more?
Through these conversations, we are creating knowledge or evidence or research. These are all, in my mind, the same word. And from what I've learned throughout my career is that all policy is evidence based. So you have to have data and evidence in order to support policy change. And so If that's the way it is, then okay, I'm going to create that evidence. And so this season is one step towards that. It is a pocket of creating evidence that will hopefully will move the needle a little bit towards localization. And I'm interested in localization from a social justice perspective that people with refugee backgrounds, global south backgrounds already have the expertise there. We just need to recognize them. And the recognition is what's missing.
Yeah.
So rather than the current discourse around localization seems, at least in my understanding, to be coming out as a conversation because of the aid cuts by the US as a pragmatic solution to be able to continue field operations on the ground. All right, let's incorporate refugee led organizations. They're already on the ground. We don't have to pay them that much. Let's incorporate them that way, call it localization. Whereas I'm more interested in kind of that agenda setting that I mentioned earlier. Who holds the power? And is it because refugee led organizations in this example have the right to lead? So, even the term, as you can see, localization, once you get into it, is really complicated and there's multiple directions that you can go. But I'm hoping that this podcast, through the storytelling, is we're generating evidence about practitioners with lived experience, elevating their voice, elevating their policy recommendations, elevating their research that they've curated, and getting it out there.
Yeah, yeah. So this is like a third part of that question around pockets of epistemic resistance. And so how do these different pockets of epistemic resistance get to challenge systems, question systems, result in actual changes in the way that, policies are driven, global development agendas are written and are driven?
It's a big question. I think this project, there's two parts. I always imagine the podcast to be the first deliverable, which is the research and the storytelling. The second part of it is the archive, which maybe we'll talk about later. But the archive is that I am elevating the experience and the credentials of these imposters as lived experience experts. And my hope is that they enter organizations to do exactly what you asked, to critique systems, suggest new ideas, advocate. My end goal is, I really truly believe that lived experience is expertise in this sector specifically, and I would like to see an industry where that is valued more and we see more practitioners with lived experience designing programs, making decisions, etc. But for this project in particular, I'm hoping that the next step is not only the evidence, but we also need people in certain positions to affect change. I learned, a long time ago, again, from civil rights thinkers in the United States, when it comes to like affecting change or social movements, you can't do it from the outside or from the inside only. You have to do both. So, developing evidence, this podcast that is generating evidence from outside of the system, but also you need allies on the inside who are willing to advocate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 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 absolutely it does. And it brings me to my next question. Let's just say that there are all these wonderful, amazing people that are listening to these conversations, right? Whether they're a practitioner, whether they work in policy, or in academia, if they do identify themselves in these conversations, what are some of the actual practical things that they should be taking away from the season and from the different conversations?
Yeah, I can see a lot of people listening to this and they leave it feeling very like uncomfortable. And I know it's so hard to sit in discomfort without having like an action plan after. Um, for what people can do next, I think it depends on who the listener is. So I'll put it in two buckets. I think if you're a practitioner in this space who does not have lived experience, I'm going to ask you an uncomfortable question. So take a deep breath. The question is, why are you interested in this work? I think you really have to sit and interrogate this inside of you. And you might recognize some parts of your motivation might make you feel uncomfortable. They might make you feel ashamed. They might make you feel defensive. And my response to that is that it's okay. Coloniality, white supremacy are systems, right? That's what every conversation has kind of come to the conclusion. They have been done to all of us. So, with that in mind, you still have to do your part and you have to confront this and begin your unlearning journey. Unlearning is one of the tenets of decolonial theory, which is you have to deconstruct knowledge that has been given to you. So, if you actually want to work in this space in a way that preserves dignity, agency of affected communities in the development and humanitarian sector, I think you do have to start with that one question of why am I interested in this? And if it simply is because of curiosity or if you're interested in saving people, for example, if this comes to your mind, second step is I would read Orientalism by Edward Said. Also, you can listen to May's episode, the second episode, in order to answer some of those questions because you're not alone. Again, we're talking about systems. This is not a personal deficit in anyone. So that's the first step is really like I can't emphasize enough, unlearning is very important. So second bucket is if there are practitioners out there who do have lived experience of maybe they're, a refugee or migrant and they're working in resettlement operations or they work in displacement, for example, as a first step, I would recommend finding a mentor that can help you identify your goals and leverage your experience. I think another theme that came out of a couple of episodes, particularly Afreen's episode, also I'm thinking Copy's episode, is that community is super important. Like, we're not going to solve anything on our own. We're definitely not going to get over this phenomenon alone. This is a collective.
Yeah.
We are a collective now. So I really believe in the power of mentorship. Honestly, like a colleague of mine mentored me throughout the creation of this podcast, and I wouldn't have made it to the finish line without her support and mentorship. So I believe in this a lot, and I especially believe in it in particular to like our practitioners, our young people situated in the global south, our refugee youth who are constantly hearing messages from the media demonizing their worth. I think it's really important to counter that with community and mentorship. And then once you have that, the most important thing is like get your ideas out there. I know personally, I would love to hear from you, and I can also definitely help you find a mentor. So please reach out and share your ideas and go from there.
Wonderful, wonderful. I know I'm asking a sort of really tough questions. But yeah, it's been so lovely just hearing you explain and getting deeply into the different conversations, connecting them into broader sector work and broader thinking. As we talk about broader thinking and just the wider sector work, the next big agenda, architecture is post 2030, right? What happens next? We've had the SDGs, and one of the biggest critiques about the SDGs is there wasn't the consideration, or there was a certain absence of local expertise, if I would say, contextual intelligence in the room. What would you say needs to be considered in this post 2030 agenda?
I think, I'm kind of just referring to what you guys told me in your conversations. I think you put it really well in your episode. Are the local voices incorporated in a way? And then, of course, people always critique that immediately by saying, well, how do we do that? Well, first, let's just acknowledge the fact that they should be incorporated, and then we can figure out how to operationalize that. But it does come down to having the local voices lead. And by leading, many of the imposters cited, who is doing the risk assessment, who is setting the agenda, who is making the decisions, and then who also is implementing and analyzing and deciding what works and what doesn't work. And I think the way to like rectify that for future conferences is our methodology around needs assessment and deciding what is important, what's a priority, what's not a priority, and making sure that all needs are being represented. And I honestly think that is the core. Like, there's so much that's coming out about how much development money has not worked over the years. And it very well could come down to maybe we were targeting the wrong problems. Maybe those weren't the problems. There's other
Yeah.
deeper structural problems.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think one of the very important things that we need to also identify when we talk about all of this is the data, right? And so just coming back to this, that such projects and such initiatives are very useful for gathering that data and that evidence to define what comes after these goals. And you've also spoken about the imposters not being one off and but it's leading somewhere. Can you tell us a bit more about your thoughts if it's not too early to share?
Sure. So, how do I see the future of the imposters? Actually, the informal slogan on social media is stay tuned as we build something bigger than a podcast. It was always my intention to build my own organization. I always thought the podcast would be the first deliverable. And then the archive is the second deliverable. And originally, when I came up with this concept, I wanted to call it the imposter roster because rosters are very common in the development and humanitarian sector. They're a list of experts that basically are on standby for big organizations, INGOs, and UN agencies to pull from for certain projects. And so I wanted to make a spin off of that by creating my roster of imposters. Unfortunately, someone already trademarked the name, so I had to change it, but the concept is still the same, where I always imagined after having the conversation on the podcast, the guest enters the archive, which is my network of lived experience experts in global development. And the next step for me is for us to essentially organize together, which is already beginning. So there's already been some like co-writing together, also referrals. If someone is looking for a researcher, they ask me and then I can refer one of the imposters. I've also, even with other guests on the season, we've already begun advocating within international organization spaces. So in small ways, we are creating those pockets of resistance as
Mhm.
Meg puts it, and that was kind of always the intent. I wasn't imagining it to kind of happen so quickly and organically, but I think that's the beauty of when you bring together a bunch of people who are on the same page and they feel safe and working together, like kind of the sky is the limit, honestly. So
Yeah.
definitely there will be a season 2 and that will be what, the public sees, but then just know also that behind the scenes, I'm really dedicated to getting these imposters research, their theories, their stories out there in published spaces, on social media, and then also through learning activities. Of course, because I have an education background, I'm already designing workshops that we can do to kind of help people continue this unlearning journey outside of the podcast. So, yeah, there's more to come. Really, we're just getting started. And in season 2, you can expect communications to come out in early fall of this year.
Wonderful, wonderful. For listeners, you mentioned season two, but also how can they engage with this work and how can they be part of this work?
Yeah, I think at this stage of the project, sharing it with people you think might be interested in this work within this sector is really helpful. Sharing it with other people who might struggle with this imposter syndrome is really a nice thing to do because another theme that came out of these conversations was, some self-healing that happened, which I wasn't really expecting, but it's been a nice experience to kind of talk through these feelings and then to have my guests, feel uplifted and feel better at the end of the conversation. So I do think the conversations can help individuals out there who are struggling with the same feelings. There's that. And then also, if you work in this sector and this resonates, I would encourage you to share it with your colleagues who may be less inclined to listen to something like this. I mean, that is the whole point, right? I have a very unique positionality where I'm Egyptian and I'm American. I'm half white American. I also spent most of my career in the United States government, which is the ultimate power holder in this industry. So I think it's really important to have not only this conversation with people who we, don't have to explain our souls to, like Tharawat said, but also we need to have these conversations with those who maybe are less inclined. And really, I'm hoping that all my past colleagues in the US government We take this time when we're experiencing real challenges with how our institutions operate to maybe consider alternative methods and alternative paths. And I think this podcast is a good first step in starting that journey.
You, Lila, for having me sit on this side of the microphone. I have really enjoyed the conversation, just you reflecting, or just us reflecting on the different conversations and different threads from across the season, but also, zooming out for what this means in the work that we both do and what's, the global architecture, can take from this, what it means moving forward for different work. And thank you for building this space. Like you said, it's really just a safe space, not just for me, but from the different conversations. You could tell that individuals are really just letting loose, we're very comfortable in having the conversation. And thank you so much for building that safe space for us all to really share our experiences and really delve deeper into what this imposter syndrome looks like and what it means for global development moving forward and local expertise really also taking a forefront in this work. You can find the full episode, the archive, and what's coming next on The Imposters on LinkedIn and other social channels. It's been a privilege, Lila. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's conversation, visit theimposters.org, where you can explore episode resources and browse the wider archive of lived experience experts. Tune in to The Imposters wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lila Raouf. Thanks so much for listening.